Published 10 years ago in 2014 by American author Pierce Brown, Red Rising is the first of what's called the Red Rising Saga, which is a series of 6 books, with the 7th book coming out soon called Red God, expected to be released sometime next year in 2025. The first book follows a young male protagonist named Darrow as he transitions from an existence as little more than a subterranean slave into an elite citizen fighting for glory within a wilderness gladiatorial arena. And so if that sentence is strange to you, now you know how I feel and how I felt as I read the story. The book is rated 4.2 stars out of 5 on GoodReads, a review that was accumulated from over 41,000 reviews. So if you like fantasy, science fiction, and horror, subscribe to my channel and like episodes that you enjoy so I will know what you want to hear. So a quick summary of this book: Mars has been colonized for hundreds of years, and there is this lower class subterranean society called Reds, as in the color, and they mine the planet for resources. Human society operates on a color-based caste system, with golds at the top as these oppressive and wealthy and beautiful overlords. 16-year-old Darrow seeks to infiltrate gold society to exact revenge after his wife is executed by the state. He ends up joining this subversive anarchist group called the Sons of Ares, who position him within the society by surgically and socially altering him to blend in with the gold caste. Infiltration is the mission, which Darrow accomplishes primarily by joining a gold soldier training institute, and he participates in this giant mock house war with real life and death stakes. The majority of the plot follows Darrow's attempts to both rise in rank as well as destabilize the institute while the gold house leaders observe from a flying castle called Olympus. The author Pierce Brown states that the book was rejected over 120 times by publishers and that he wrote the book over a 2-month period in his parents' garage in Seattle. This book hit the New York Times top 20 upon publication, and I don't see any books outside of this series or genre that has been written by Pierce Brown. So let's get into the review. I originally began to listen to the book while doing tasks, and I quickly decided that I actually wanted to read the physical book so that I could concentrate on it. The quality of the audiobook was great, with music and sound effects and this great narrator, and so if you want to listen to the audiobook instead of reading the physical copy, I suggest that you find that one that is dramatized. It was very good. So I went into the plot, as I do with most books that I read, with zero information. So I was genuinely surprised when it suddenly turned into a story that is best described as the Hunger Games, but for men. There are some very key differences, especially in, I think the biggest difference between this and the Hunger Games would be in character motivations. But I mean, this book, it just has to be talked about in reference to the Hunger Games, which was released several years before this book, and I think kind of definitely influenced it. If not explicitly, then implicitly, as it actually devolves into a socially approved and controlled fight to the death among young adults, which is very similar to the Hunger Games. And Hunger Games wasn't even the first to do that, but this feels like the immediate, what I would call like the spiritual successor maybe of that series. It's got similar themes like these oppressive dystopian governments and the brutality of mankind, but revenge is Darrow's primary motivation, even though he plays the long game as he seeks it. And I find that revenge is a tried and true theme, and especially if your audience is younger men, if they are the market for the book. And who among us doesn't love to hate characters sometimes? The objective is revenge is less of a person and more of a system, but there are plenty of unlikable people among the way who get their comeuppance. There are frequent uses of similar words from the Hunger Games, like reaping and reaper and scythe, as well as the parallel uses of ancient Roman names and titles and themes, which was the case obviously in the Hunger Games. Ancient Rome continues to demand our attention thousands of years after the fact, and the Roman, I think what makes it so compelling, ancient Rome so compelling, is the state-sanctioned public brutality. And that lends itself to adaptation for fantasy and science fiction. And so I don't particularly mind the Roman themes here. The class and personality division by color, however, in my opinion, has moved from the trope territory into the cliche territory at this point. So what I mean is that, as I mentioned earlier, the caste system in this universe is specified and stereotyped by color. So what that means is that the reds in the society, they are tough and they are subterranean. Pinks are these feminine and sexual figures. Golds are wealthy and elite. And after some research into this trope and what's becoming what I think a cliche, I learned that a lot of critics call this trope the Planet of Hats trope, where an author uses one shared characteristic of a group to stereotype everyone within that trait. And so just off the top of my head, if we're thinking of Hunger Games and young adult type series, of course you have Harry Potter come to mind. You have the four houses with their corresponding color, and it's fair to assume that each character within that group has a shared characteristic. Another one that comes to mind is Divergent, and this is just becoming something that feels like a cliche at this point. I mean, it makes sense. I am not an author, so I can appreciate at least what this trope does. It gives the author a chance to, I guess, identify characters with a broad brush in a limited number of pages, but it definitely stunts and limits character arcs and plot twists, I think. I didn't find any profound literary notions here, but honestly that's okay, because the purpose of this book is clearly just to entertain. There is more plot movement here and more ground covered, both literally and figuratively, and I was interested, honestly, all the way up to the conclusion, which has a nice payoff. Many times, I will give a book 3 stars automatically if it just has a nice payoff, and so this one definitely has that. I would describe the mood as rather nervous and sad, and it only really drags near the end of the second act. It feels to me just as much like a screenplay as it does a novel, and I would be very surprised if this is not adapted at some point for a streaming service. And what's interesting, there were several interesting things about the prose and the way that Brown wrote this book. The first thing is that he doesn't seem to mind spoiling his own book, because the chapter titles throughout the book basically spoil the contents of that chapter before it even happens. And speaking of the prose, it's honestly pretty elementary at best. And I mean, Brown, the author, he likes to use, I noticed, these fragment sentences to give Darrow some type of urgency, I think. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And the, I guess the vocabulary, it's not very challenging for your average reader. Advanced readers may find that the prose is too simple and that simple prose gets in the way of the story, but if you agree with me, I would say that taken simply for what it is, which is basic entertainment, you shouldn't be disappointed in the prose here. And this is interesting because my initial impression of the book is that it is targeted for young adults, meaning preteens and early teenagers, maybe people aged 14 to 17 or 14 to 18. That's how it reads to me. But I've also read online that the rest of the series is actually much closer to Game of Thrones than it is to the Hunger Games. And so we will see how that turns out. I actually want to keep reading this series. The limited vocabulary does have a downside though. It reflects limited character ranges. But honestly, I find Darrow to be decently believable as a person, much more than I found Katniss in the Hunger Games. But to be honest, don't come to this book expecting layers here with Darrow or anyone else. I finished the book about 2 weeks ago, and I can only remember 2 or 3 other characters. The rest of the characters in the book were basically cannon fodder to raise the body count of the book, which is surprisingly high, by the way. Or the character is there to fill an archetype role. So for example, you've got the wild man who wears animal furs and sleeps outside. You've got the spirited woman, a Mustang. You've got the barbarian with a huge body and an aggressive personality. The characters feel more like D&D pre-made adventures than other characters in other series, but again, I don't think the characters are the main reason you're reading this book. The reason I kept reading, and I intend to continue reading this series, is that the world here is interesting and different enough to continually pique my curiosity. The book is relatively short and the pace moves very quickly, and so before you even have time to get bored, you're finished with the book. The slower parts of the book, I think, are what feels like mandatory romance scenes, but those are surrounded by scenes of violence, and so you don't linger on them too long. Overall, I think Red Rising is an okay book. If you're less interested in complex political plots and more interested in the male power fantasy of revenge and government resistance, this is the book for you. This is also the book I would recommend that you take on an airplane or that you take to the beach. I give Red Rising 3 stars out of 5. If you like this episode, or if you disagree, or if you notice something I didn't mention in this review, sound off in the comments on my YouTube channel. I'll see you in the next episode, and happy reading.